you went through something horrible that you shouldn't have gone through. You went through something because another person wasn't emotionally intelligent enough to regulate their own bullshit to not then project it onto you.
So I honor, I respect, I celebrate the people who recognize that just because where you are right now doesn't mean that you're always going to have to be there. And just because you're doing the work doesn't mean that you're going to lose your chip. You're not going to lose your edge. If anything, there's so much more to gain.
Hey everybody, it's Bianca.
And it's Emilia. Welcome back.
This is going to be an episode that I love this topic. I love talking about trauma, and I know you do too. And
Mhm.
this this episode in particular came from a client of mine who I really have a soft spot for. We grew up in very similar backgrounds, and so I really relate to him on a lot of the experiences that he had, and that was actually why he started working with me because,
Mm.
we're both Middle Eastern, and he knew that I had a lot of knowledge about what growing up in that environment is like and what it's like growing up with ethnic parents, especially ethnic Middle Eastern parents who had very different belief structures and were honestly really stuck in, the time frame of when they moved here. They
Yeah.
never acculturated, they never grew up from that time, for lack of a better phrase. And this client, unfortunately, suffered a lot of trauma at the hands of his dad. Um, his father was never physically abusive towards him, but he was very emotionally and verbally abusive. And he would never hit the family, but like they were punching holes in the wall. They were like very just violent.
Yeah.
And he learned from a really young age numb, dissociate, hide, don't have any problems. Everyone's problems are more important than yours. And in fact, not only that, you cause our problems. So you need to make sure that you don't do anything to piss us off. Kind of going to that episode of a parentified child, which we already talked about.
Right.
But so this client came to me because he was experiencing really bad PTSD symptoms and we've been working together for over a year now, and he's made really incredible progress. But working through his trauma, he's just really scared of it.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, why are you having such a hard time? Obviously, I didn't frame it like this, but ultimately the question came down to why are you holding on to your trauma the way that you are? Why are you holding on to the patterns that you know are harming you, but you can't seem to let go of? Because he said, he's like, I don't want to let go of this. And I was
Yeah.
like, why? And he literally said, I went through all of this stuff and convinced myself that it made me stronger. And
Mhm.
me being stronger then made me better than everybody else because I was more capable of handling things than they were. And I was like, oh
Mhm.
my God. When we go through trauma, we kind of have to cling to whatever narrative we can to get ourselves through it. Some people dissociate. Some people will justify their parents' behavior that they don't know better or that, like, well, they're bad, so they need to get better and it's not the parent's fault, whatever the case may be. Or not even just parent, whatever, right? Whoever it is that's perpetuating the trauma.
Right.
When you're in a traumatic experience, whether it's big T or little t, you have to be able to create a narrative and a meaning around the trauma in order to be able to get yourself through it.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, your brain is like, what the hell is going on? This doesn't make sense. This doesn't fit. And we're in massive danger. Like, our brain can't handle that. So, it has to create narratives and or situations to be able to tolerate. So you've talked very openly about the fact that you dissociated and that
Yeah.
was the way that your brain learned how to regulate yourself and keep you safe during a lot of the traumatic experiences that you had been through during childhood and growing up into adolescence and into your teenage years.
Mhm.
For this client, he not only dissociated, but he also developed a narrative that this made me stronger. This actually made me better than other people. I'm actually extremely strong.
Right.
And he literally said, I'm wearing my trauma like a badge of honor
Mhm.
because he didn't know how else to deal with it. And he didn't know how to be vulnerable. And that I'm absolutely terrified and I'm scared and I don't have anywhere safe to go because I'm being bullied at school and I'm being bullied at home. So
Yeah.
this protector was like, well, I'm big and strong and I can handle it all. Um, what's the downside of that? When you wear your trauma like a badge of honor, when you convince yourself of this narrative that, like, you can only be strong, you're only resilient, you're only all of these things because you went through trauma. Like, what is the downside of that? Why should people care?
It's a really important question. Um, Honestly, like, what we're really talking about is this a concept of, identity constancy. It's a bias that
Constancy?
yeah, constancy. So,
Okay.
like, for example, if we so for example, this client of yours identifies as someone who is, resilient, right? Like, that's the narrative that his brain has pulled into the equation, right? So he identifies as someone who's resilient, right? That's why it's a badge of honor, not, a wound, right? It's seen way more as a really good thing, right? Like a really adaptive, constructive thing for him. Um, the downside of that is any evidence that comes his way that shows him contrary evidence that kind of comes up against this identity,
Yeah.
he's going to have a really hard time accepting it. So, for example, if he comes into, let's just say, a intimate relationship, and all of a sudden, his partner recognizes that shouldering all of that weight, all of that burden, this protecting and armoring up is so much such that he can't ever get vulnerable or he can't ever
Mhm.
see his strength as being anything outside of that identity. He's going to deny himself of what I would say actually really reintegrating his trauma in an adaptive, healthy manner. Not only that, but the coping skills that he's going to have developed and constantly um, retread, right? The not letting go. The coping skills, quote unquote, that he's developed are going to be maladaptive, meaning they're not going to be healthy and functioning for him. And they're going to re-perpetuate this trauma again and again. So let's say again that intimate relationship, shouldering all of the weight, being this knight in shining armor, but yet not having the ability to actually connect deeper within the more softer parts of you. I'm just air
Mhm.
quoting that's gonna really start to disconnect himself beyond disassociation, right? It's going to go beyond just being able to connect to all the other parts of you that are being neglected as a result of the trauma that you're self-inducing because of your coping strategies. So it's,
100%.
epigenetics at its finest, where the toxic cycle that's brought in and modeled as a result of his father's behaviors and lack of um, capabilities to navigate the trauma, right? The generational, the cultural, the gender trauma. That cycle will perpetuate into his intimate relationship. It will perpetuate into his inability to probably get close with people, um, trust people. I bet that's going to impact him in a way such that he's going to have massive trust issues because ultimately he doesn't know how to trust himself without that badge of honor. He doesn't know how to yet, and I'm sure through the work that you guys are doing, recognize how valuable, worthy, lovable, and important and how enough he is
Mm.
if he were to actually reintegrate the trauma from a more adaptive standpoint instead of this big bravado type protector part.
100%. I think one of the other really troubling things too is that because we're all a lot of us have been modeled the like, "Oh, you think you have it bad? Listen to what I went through." Narrative. We don't actually get the help that we need because we're leveling up our pains and wounds against other people, and that somehow
It's like a pissing match.
it's like it what's the opposite of enable? I was gonna say disenable, but that's not a word. It doesn't allow you to get the help that you need because in some way, shape, or form, we're getting vindication for what we've
Dece
been through of like, "I went through it so bad," and we get more validation from, like, having had it worse than other people
Mhm.
and actually working through the damage that that
Facts.
really caused. Like,
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
know this client too, his dad used his own trauma as validation for what he was doing to his children.
Oh,
Like,
yeah. That's
when
so
I was
common.
when I was your age, my parents did this, this, and this, and we had to do all of these
Sweet
terrible
thing.
things.
Right.
Yeah, we had to walk 12 miles in the rain and in sand and whatever other BS the narratives were, like, to go to school, and the story always was more and more exaggerated, it's hilarious.
Every single time,
Every
right?
time the story's like, I had to go, like, hustle with a dealer to find a camel to ride to school, it's like, "Alright, please shut up." But it's like,
Doesn't negate that might have been a reality, but that doesn't
okay,
necessarily
yes,
mean that it
but, like,
serves in the way in which the behavior as a
n
result of that in parenting
no,
does.
we use what we went through to validate the actions that we're doing towards other people, and a lot of his
Yeah.
parents I'll speak specifically about this client. His parents used, "Well, we had it worse, so you have nothing to complain about,"
So
as
invalidating.
a
No,
way
I
to justify what they were doing to him, and then because he then
yeah.
internalized that, he's, like, being dis he's being invalidated in so many different regards. And so
Gaslit.
it's like, yeah, he's being completely gaslit.
Yeah.
Like, "Oh, I'm having it really bad, but they're telling me it's not that bad. So now I have to build up this massive protector of it's not that bad, but also look at how much I can handle." And it's like you're being you're being tormented mentally on
Literally.
all of these different fronts. And then you never actually get to work through this trauma. You and I were rumbling a tiny, tiny bit before we dove into this episode because I said,
Mm.
"You don't have to go through trauma to become resilient." And you were like, "Well, challenges do make you resilient." And I'm like, "Yes, challenges make you resilient, but you don't have to be traumatized and have these horrible things happen to you for you to be resilient and strong. There's other ways of gaining strength. There's other ways of challenging yourself that make you more competent." But when we have these narratives that, like, the only trauma that's valid is these massive horrific things that happen and I didn't really have it that bad, so what am I complaining about? But then that also doesn't allow you to challenge yourself to build any sense of resiliency and to expand and grow and do more in your life. It's like, what do you do at that point? You're kinda
Right.
stuck in this conundrum of a lose-lose situation no matter what.
Yeah, and I had said, there is no excuse for abuse. There's
Absolutely not.
absolutely no excuse for abuse. And there's someone that's coming to mind that I know, and this is probably, going to illuminate a character that someone else knows in listening to this episode, that was so fearful. The trauma that he had experienced as a result of his alcoholic mother and the abuse from his stepdad and just the wild abuse that came his way as a child, right? He developed this narrative as well, very similar to your client that, well, if I lose, if I proactively try to transform this badge of honor, right? I'm going to lose the chip on my shoulder, right? Because
I'm
one of
gonna
the
lose my
things that
edge.
exactly, lose my edge, right? That's something that I've heard a lot, especially from males. I'm afraid that I'm gonna lose my edge, right? Because and that's a great indicator of how much you've actually identified with this protector that has been trying to help you survive throughout all the trauma and adversity that you did experience, which to the point that was illuminated earlier. If you start to identify, it's actually called fusion. It's fusion with a specific part of you that's been protected. That fusion or enmeshment with that part, it doesn't actually allow self separation for reflection and a candid look at what actually happened to you from a trauma standpoint. And as a result of that, you don't actually process, illuminate the exiled part of you that actually do hold that deep traumatic experience or experiences, the deep low valence emotions, the deep maladaptive coping skills, inner dialogues that have been developed. And that fusion is so powerful because you literally start to identify with this protective part such that you never actually look back and reflect upon your experiences of trauma and adversity that holds anyone to account for their own actions, behaviors, and what actually happened to you. And so that it becomes very scary to use the words that I've heard from my male clients in particular. It becomes extremely scary to even imagine what or who, right? Because it's on the identity level B, who you would become if you were to actually unfuse with this protective part of you, who
Mhm.
you would become actually experiencing those exiled parts of you, and who would you become, not to mention just even as a man, as a dad, as a partner, right? All of these roles in the male gender. Would you become less masculine because you're more in
Mhm.
touch with those emotions? Would you still be a man if you didn't wear your trauma like a badge of honor, right? Would you
Will
still be
women
all of these
to
things?
me?
Right, right. Talk about the archetype of the classic badass in high school. That badass is actually in a series of protest behaviors because they're so disconnected from themselves and so wildly emotionally neglected that they are wearing their trauma like a badge of honor, and their behaviors are doing rebellious things to try to. It's all these cries for help, right? Like I'm the best. I'm stronger than everyone. Let me show people so loudly and boldly of how nothing can touch me, right? What happens if you lose that chip?
This
What's
doesn't just
wild,
I'm sorry, I
I was
thought
just
you were
gonna
done.
say, what's wild is that more often than not, I actually haven't found another case that says the contrary. When you actually unfuse and you go from enmeshment with that part to actually providing safe space where you can examine that and you can recognize like, oh, how did I get to that fusion of my
Mhm.
identity where like this protective part of me is actually, I've identified it as me, as true self, and you start to really create some distance between that. There's actually so much healing that actually is allowed as a result of that, right? There's so much of the ability to let go, to what you were
Mhm.
saying at the very beginning with this client. You can actually let go of that stuff because you recognize that it never was full true self you anyways. And it's not necessarily it never it's just like you lose it forever, right? You lose that chip forever. It's rather you actually have the space and the choice to reintegrate it as a part of you that doesn't control you anymore. And I think that that's what's so powerful about this.
And then you can use more adaptive beliefs and goals and dreams and aspirations as your motivators. This ties into the episode that we did, does shame work as a motivator?
Right.
No. You can't consistently and adaptively run that cycle and have it not burn you to the ground. And I know we're using men a lot as examples in this episode, but even for the women out there, how many of
Definitely.
you feel like you have to be a perfectionist in order to be good enough? How
Right.
many of you have developed a belief that you have to be the good girl, the good daughter, the good whatever as a trauma response? Because if you were loud or if you did anything outside of the expected norm, you had bad things happen. Or you
Mhm.
need to be quiet or whatever. You need to be small, like whatever that thing is. Shame and trauma do not work as adaptive motivators. They are not something to hold as a badge of honor.
Mm.
You went through something horrible that you shouldn't have gone through. You went through something because another person wasn't emotionally intelligent enough to regulate their own bullshit to not then project it onto you.
Facts.
And you had to suffer the consequences of it. You might have become more resilient as a result of it, but it's not the only reason you're resilient, and it's not the
Right.
only thing that's going to keep you safe and resilient. Like, a lot of trauma survivors develop hypervigilance, this sense of always being alert and aware and, like, constantly observing their environment, and they believe that they have to keep that in order to be safe. But
Which
you only believe that because that actually was true when you were in the traumatic instance, but you're
right.
not in the traumatic instance anymore. You're not in the traumatizing event anymore. But perpetuating that cycle, you don't actually get to see that, "Oh, I can actually let this go and I'm gonna be okay." You don't get to learn that there's more healthy, functional habits, behaviors, tendencies, beliefs, skill sets that are available to you that you can now utilize instead of your trauma and your
Yeah.
shame and your guilt and a lot of the negative beliefs and paradigms and schemas that you've had to develop to keep yourself safe in a really dangerous environment.
Yeah.
It might have made you strong because you endured something terrible, but it doesn't mean that it's gonna keep you strong, and it doesn't mean that it's gonna keep you safe. It's actually probably doing more damage than good to continue perpetuating the cycle that you had to do and that you had to learn when you were facing trauma.
I couldn't agree more. It reminds me of a client that I have that has complex post traumatic stress disorder and the hypervigilance that he experiences. And that one, um, I would say, side effect, for lack of better words, has contributed to so many health issues in
Mm,
his later years of life because when he was younger, he didn't have people like you and me. And he didn't know enough to have someone in his ear and say, "Hey, that's actually, you wearing your trauma like that badge of honor, right? That hypervigilance that you're experiencing. That's actually like something that you can work through as you reestablish the connection to your body, as you reestablish the recognition that you're not like that served you at one point, but it's not going to continue to serve you because the way in which you're functioning now, you're significantly less of what you could be in terms of like overall cognitive function,
mhm.
stress management, decision making, right? All of that is far more impaired because his brain is constantly having to scan his environment for this perceptive threat that doesn't exist anymore. It did when he was a child, but it's not serving him
Yeah.
now. And other clients that I've had that really do, they're so fused with their protectors and look at the view look at the world as such a negative place as a result of them not actually recognizing how much they've been fused with this protective part of them. And the world is bad and the world's just a crappy place, right? And the world view starts to get tainted because of so much fusion with this protective part. And it's been really wonderful to see clients of ours really navigate through their trauma and recognize that yes, there's so much to be proud of self and your parts of how it got you through those times of survival when you didn't have anyone else to turn towards and you didn't know how to navigate through, having an abusive parent or an alcoholic parent or an emotionally neglectful parent, right? Like
Mhm.
it had gotten you through that season, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that role of getting you through it still is going to serve the best version of yourself now. And it's been really incredible to see how much more joy is accessible, how much less suffering clients have to go through and self-induce, and how much more fulfilling holistically and wholesome of a life that it can actually live when they do actually work through some of this stuff, right? So I'm proud of your client for him working, you know really, and showing up consistently and doing this work. I'm so proud of the trauma survivors that are in the evolved community that are choosing to work through their own experiences, not only the trauma events and uncovering really what had happened to them, but also the
Mhm.
coping strategies that were maladaptive and unhelpful that generations of trauma have compounded and brought into one's life. Like, for example, right now, B, I'm actually doing, I think I had mentioned this to you. I'm doing a deep study into genomics and the intersectionality of trauma. And one of my homeworks for my cohort was to do a 3-layered genogram. And essentially, for anyone who doesn't know what those are, it's like a family tree, but all of the traumas, all of the relational social issues that have come into the family tree. It's not just the people and the names and when they were alive and when they died. It's the dash. All of what happened in between those moments of when they were born and when they died and what contributed to that.
Well,
So it's a big assignment and it's overwhelming as hell, but what I think is really exciting about that is that as evolvers in this community, if you're someone that's listening to this episode, you're someone that is recognizing that a part of you is recognizing that you're wearing your trauma like a badge of honor and that has served you at one point in time. And there's another part of you that's likely that true self version of you that recognizes that's actually not what's helping me become my best self. And so I honor, I respect, I celebrate the people who recognize that just because where you are right now doesn't mean that you're always going to have to be there. And just because you're doing the work doesn't mean that you're going to lose your chip. You're not going to lose your edge. If anything, there's so much more to gain on the other side of doing this beautiful work that really is ahead of you and so much just waiting for you to be, uncovered about yourself. So I get super excited, like you said, talking about this topic. You and I geek out over trauma and over, trauma recovery, what's possible for
mm,
people. And I think that there's so much in this episode for not only your client just listening back and seeing how far he's come if he does listen, but also to all of those people that might have felt like him at one point or another, where wearing that badge doesn't necessarily equivocate to strength. So much of strength is multifaceted and it's a
mm,
spectrum, right? It doesn't just exist in a 2D narrative being, the best or whatever. Sometimes strength does exist in just the courage to cry, right? That's strength too. So,
facts. What's your episode suggestion?
did we do this one justice for you?
I love this. I could keep talking about
Good.
this. I could talk about this all day.
Same. Same. It's like, talk to me about genomics. I want to tell you all the things. All right. 140, you are not defined by your trauma would be my
Mm,
episode suggestion. If you liked this one,
308. What stories are your inner critic writing?
nice.
We hope you reach out. You might have not had a big T trauma happened in your life, but we've all had experiences that have really negatively impacted us and that have shaped us in one way or another. And letting yourself work through those and see how you can become an even greater version of yourself is a beautiful gift that you can give to yourself and that you can give to the people in your life who are going to be positively impacted by you, thriving. So we hope you
Mm.
reach out. evolveventurestech.com/therapy is where you can get all the information on getting involved. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Everyone.